Chunhua and Tom. Hello there. And Jacqueline. Hello there. All right. Okay. So, all right. So yeah, as Steve mentioned, I was a little behind schedule in preparing all the readings and everything. So you guys had very little time to actually read them, but there were so many questions. And as usual, they're, very good questions and actually, a lot of very piercing questions, really questioning the things that I'm saying, and I think that's great. So also when I answer your questions, and sometimes I'm going to be arguing back at you, but I just want to say that it's great that you're arguing with me in the questions. So I really appreciate that, as you really point out some of the potential weaknesses or problems with the arguments that I'm bringing. And so that's exactly, what I think is great in this kind of these reflective questions that you're submitting. So these readings were about the notion of spiritual capital and generally about, let's say, volunteering and altruism related to religion and spirituality and so on. And so actually this stimulated, and the examples that I gave also stimulated all kinds of different questions and arguments. And I think that there's basically three issues here that need to be kind of disentangled or separated in order to look at the issue clearly. And the first is the question of purity of motive. So this is the first one. I mean, right. How do we understand people's motives? How do we know what kind of motives people have? And what's the connection between the purity of motive and spirituality and religion? So this is the first issue, is related to purity of motive. And the second one is the actual behavior of religious groups, religious people, religious groups and organizations, and also non-religious people, groups and organizations. So is it possible, is it reasonable to assume that religious people are more selfless, let's say, and religious organizations are more selfless? And what about non-religious people? And what about non-religious groups? Can we really say that they're more selfish? And so, and actually I will say no. Okay, so right away my answer is that, but I will discuss that a little bit more. Okay, so basically, so this is a second issue about the actually existing religious and non-religious people and religious and non-religious organizations. So that's the second issue. And the third one is the actual effects of actions. So what is the actual result of people's actions, regardless of whether they're so one could have a pure motive, but actually the effect of what actually you're doing something that has a bad effect. That's quite possible. And one could have an impure motive, but actually do something that has a good effect. So the effect of our actions. So I think there are three issues to separate here. One is purity of motive. The second is religious identity or non-religious identity. And the third is the objective results of people's actions. And so I'm going to talk about those three aspects one by one. And then I'm also going to just address a few other points that were made in your questions. So basically, the example I gave, it talked about these volunteers in the Hanwang, in the place where the earthquake had taken place, and so there were 2 years after the earthquake. So most people were no longer paying any attention to this anymore. During the 1 or 2 months after the earthquake, so many people in China, were rushing to help and talking about it all the time. And there was all this outpouring of help and altruism, everything like that. But, after a while, then people just go back to their normal lives, and nobody's really paying much attention to what's going on in the earthquake zone. But for 2 years, actually, the people in Hanwang still had no place to live. So they were living in a temporary, almost like a refugee camp in a sense, a temporary kind of settlement And so what's going on there, and sort of they're being provided with basic, living allowance, and of course they're being provided by the government with whatever they need to eat and to survive and so on. And some of them are trying to find jobs and everything like that. But then when you look at the kind of group NGOs that were around, they were actually religious ones. And actually this really struck me. I was very surprised because well, actually, it's a very interesting experimental situation because there are three types of organizations that could theoretically be active, providing, volunteer care in addition to basic necessities, right? So you have the government is providing basic necessities. So that just to make sure that everybody's alive, and so their basic food and shelter needs, their basic needs are being provided by the government. And a certain number of other services are being provided by the government. But that's very, very basic. So then on top of that, like what about all these children who are they were traumatized by the earthquake, they lost their parents or they lost family members. They don't really have a real school anymore. So they need a lot of help. They need psychological support, all kinds of additional things that are just not really handled by the basic material needs. So there are three kinds of organizations that could theoretically be coming in as volunteers to do that. And so basically you have the群众组织, right? Basically the mass organizations under the guidance of the Communist Party. So actually these are huge organizations which have absolutely no lack of any kind of resources. And in fact, they're also very involved in organizing volunteers in China. So whether it's 全国妇联 or 共青团 or all kinds of other organizations, they have many, many volunteer, they have a huge infrastructure, and obviously they are very legal, very official. And so no problem for them to go out and no logistical or legal problems for them to go and provide volunteer services. But I was quite surprised that they were not present there. And then the other kind of group is non-religious NGOs. And so NGOs in China is also very difficult for NGOs to survive. So, there are many NGOs in China and many, many non-religious kind of social organizations and things like that. But the environment is very difficult, so you have to be careful in what you're doing. So I was surprised that there were no such secular NGOs. Well, there was actually one of the three groups that I studied were actually a secular group, but then I saw the members of the group were religious. Okay, so it was a non-religious group, but the members who are volunteers were actually religious. So then the third type of group is the religious groups. And so there are huge challenges to be able to be going there as a long-term volunteers, as individuals to volunteer for such a long time, and also for an organization to do that. And so what struck me was facing those challenges, who really had the 很最坚定, right? Not giving up in terms of, like the volunteers, basically like they gave up 2 years of their life to be living, some of them came from Beijing, others from Chengdu, and, gave 2 years of their life for, very low. They're going to be paid only like 300 or 400 yuan per month just to, just for eating, a little bit of living allowance, living in this kind of cabin, very bad kind of conditions. And in China, especially in 2008, maybe now the volunteering actually, because of after what happened with the earthquake, volunteering became much more, the government is really promoting volunteering a lot. But at that time, it was still not so strongly legitimate in China. So if you're going to go out and spend 2 years of your life out in this earthquake place, your family members are going to be saying, no, don't do that. Your family member are going to be opposed to it. Most people are going to think you're crazy. Everybody's going to be worried about, well, what about your career? All of these different things. So you got to be have something that's going to most people just would, they might want to do it and think about it, but after a while they would either they wouldn't go, or they would go for a short time then come back. So just to go there, and then when you go there, you'll find all these kind of challenges. And that's just for the individual volunteer. But then you have the organization. It will also end up with so many troubles, bureaucratic problems, legal problems, and everything like that. So why would you go through all this trouble, you know? So if you don't have some deep, deep, strong motivation, you will give up, okay? So it was interesting in this experimental context, because like in another country, it's very easy for any organization to exist. So religious organization, non-religious organization, any organization can exist very easily. So all the organizations will be there. No such strong kind of pressures that would discourage most people. But actually, so in mainland China, there are many kinds of pressures that will discourage most people. So who will be left over when you've got all these kind of pressures that will discourage most people? And so I was surprised, because my research project was not about religious volunteers. It was about volunteers, any kind of volunteer. So when I went there, they were all religious. So I was just, it was kind of like a natural experiment, so to speak. Now, but I'm going to give you a few other examples of places that the volunteer groups that I visited that actually were not religious, but they showed me something. And for me, they kind of showed me something about human spirituality in a non-religious way. So, because some of you asked about that, is it possible to have this motivation to serve in a non-religious way, right? And so I'll give you some examples. So actually, the three examples I used in my reading, that was in the prefabricated settlement in near Hanwang, of all the people who were whose homes were destroyed by the earthquake. But actually in the town, the larger town of Hanwang, which was not destroyed by the earthquake, I met another volunteer group. And this was not a religious group. But and they were another group that was subsisting after 2 years, another rare group that was subsisting after 2 years. But what was striking to me was that this group actually became quasi-religious. So it actually became their way of talking and their way of behaving, it actually became like a religion. So it really struck me. So basically, and it was actually kind of funny, because I don't know if for those of you who are from Sichuan, or you know about Sichuan people, but I mean, I lived in Sichuan for many years. So basically, Sichuan people love having fun. Okay, they're very, very fun-loving people, and there's a certain type of Sichuan people. I mean, I know a lot of them. They really love spending most of their time eating hot pot and playing mahjong. Okay, so that's all they do. Everybody knows that, right? Sichuan people are 最悠闲的 in all of China. They're not, I think they really spend, so many of them spend literally all their free time playing mahjong, and they're quite addicted to it. So what struck me is I went into Hanwang and I visited this particular group, and this was a group of business, small entrepreneurs. So they owned, like, one person owned a photography studio, another person owned like right, was a wedding photography studio. Another person like owned a maybe a home decoration company. So these were small entrepreneurs, 个体户, right? They had small business owners. And I mean, I lived in Sichuan many years, and when I met them, I know exactly this is the kind of people. I met so many of them when I was in Sichuan. They are good, business people. And then when they're in their free time, that's what they do. They play mahjong and eat hot pot. Okay, that's the kind of people they are. They were really just very typical, this kind of people. They were not the kind of person who loves serving others and volunteering and all these wonderful things. No, they were just very, very typical, I wired it in, okay? Now, but they told me when there was the earthquake, and then everybody was running around in the street, screaming, and and then it's like, and then somebody's like, they were there, and they're like, I gotta help, I gotta help. So suddenly something in their heart just popped out of them, and they were like, I've got to go and help. I've got to do something, And then kind of spontaneously, within a day after the earthquake, so these small business entrepreneurs, I guess they knew each other, so they started texting each other and everything like that, and they went out and they started to to go and do something. And then they saw that there were these children who lost their parents, and who and who were completely, and then they started to do something for those children, like immediate kind of help for them. So they were doing that like so many other people, right? Now, but after a while, then all the immediate needs were kind of solved, right? Okay. But then they saw that the children had no school, right? Or their parents had no money to send them to school. So the education was completely collapsed, right? And so then they decided to become a real organization in order to continue to help these children with their education, to provide them support. Because even though the government provided some kind of makeshift temporary school, but the children, maybe they were psychologically disturbed, or they had no parents, there were so many problems that they couldn't study properly. So this group decided to help them, to give them tutoring, and to do all kinds of things for them. And then but they had so many challenges. They had so many challenges. So then they were spending all their time helping these children. So then even their own, either their husbands or their wives were like, stop it, and then other people were like, well, what about your business, and then the government would not allow their organization to be registered. So they were having all of these challenges all over the place. But then so they started to talk for me, the language they used, it was in a religious way. They were saying, for our love, we love these children. We're going to do everything for our love. And that's the only thing that matters. And we're going to give up everything else. And they, and so actually one of them got divorced. And the other one, their business, they kept their business going, but kind of ignoring their business. And then the mahjong and the hot pot, just forget about it, okay? Like all they were doing was really completely devoted to this. And so then they talked about, and then they become such strong friends among each other. It became like, they were their own group, always devoted so much to helping these children, and becoming more and more separate from the rest of society, because the rest of society could not understand why they're doing this, what they're doing, why are they putting themselves into so much trouble and everything like that. They were not being honored as heroes by the newspapers or anything like that. So nobody was thanking them. Nobody was really, and maybe some government officials would say, oh, yeah, but not really helping them in any way, So, they became this, but they had no God, okay? They were not religious, but all they said was, "爱," all the time, 为了爱，我们爱这些孩子，我们要为了这些爱，我们会一切，然后其他的我们什么都不管。So it became a kind of a religion of love for them. Yeah. So I was very impressed. So for me, what this showed was also, it showed about our spirituality, okay? So there's something in their heart that burst open, their pure spirit burst open at that time. But there's no organizational structure to help them. So then they kind of created their own kind of social, their kind of close group, bonding themselves, supporting each other, to support this kind of their spirit of altruism and helping others. So this was one example. Now, unfortunately, because of the lack of time to do the research, I wasn't able to go into enough depth into this group, and especially to find out what happened later on. But what was clear is that they were a non-religious group, but in order to sustain themselves, they actually became quasi-religious, or almost something similar to a kind of religious group, which was really interesting. Now then another group, and this is that I actually published an article with my student on it, so maybe later I'll send the link, is about a school for migrant children in Beijing, for the children of migrants in Beijing. And actually this was really interesting because so of course there are many volunteers all over the place, and even many of you have probably already volunteered a lot, and now you have to volunteer even often, like if you I mean, I don't know, well, no, but if you're in mainland Chinese university, it's quite possible that you are required to do volunteer work. And so many, you know, they're just, and then the government organizes all kinds of volunteers, like for the Olympic Games, for this kind of big event, big meeting. So, you know, there's all kinds of people who are doing all kind of volunteering, but usually that's like, you know, for one event or a few hours a week. So it's no big deal. Like, it's not really a big sacrifice, right? But in this school for the children of migrants, well, there were that kind of volunteer. Okay, so we didn't pay too much attention to them, but there were some volunteers in the school who also like literally gave up their career to help these children of migrant workers. Like was an engineer, for example, a well-established engineer, you know, who was living very well, had a very good professional life, and then he went to the school, actually just because he wanted to help a little bit, but then he somehow, again, something burst in his heart, and then he just decided to devote himself completely full time. And so he gave up his career and everything like that, and he became the principal of this school, and, you know, really giving everything up. And there were others like that too, you know, who just like, they just gave everything up. You can't really use a rational choice theory to explain it, because the material and career cost to them was very, very high. Some of them were very well established in their career, and others actually like were well, you know, performing students in university, and they could go on to a good job right away, but they decided not to. Okay. So they did this, and then, okay, so then what we found was they were not religious, and they didn't know anything about religion. So this has nothing to do with religion, so to speak. Okay. But one thing, there was two things that they did not want to be identified as. And so first of all, clearly they did not want to be like promoted as heroes, like 志愿者, and like you read in the newspaper, heroically sacrificing themselves and everything like that. And they were, no, you know, we're just ordinary, and I don't know, I just wanted to help, and that's it. You know, I'm not trying to, I don't know if I'm doing any great thing. All I just, you know, at that moment, I saw these children and they were looking at me in their eyes, and I just decided to do something. And, you know, they don't want to be, they don't claim that they're making any big sacrifice for the nation or for anything like that. So they do not want to be identified with this kind of socialist theory of sacrifice. But then they also did not, or could not be identified with the kind of self-interested rational choice, because obviously not. You know, their family was so, didn't understand what they're doing. So even many of them didn't even tell their family. So they actually lied to their family, telling that actually it's a part-time job, or actually I'm doing it for this, or I'm doing it for that. Because their family thought they had some, once they told their family or their friends thought they have a mental problem to be doing this. Okay. So, you know, so, and then some of them just said, like, stop asking us why we're doing this. Okay. And even one of them said, in a blog, she said, 这是我们的一种信仰. Okay. And so actually then again, she brought up a kind of faith, but it's not a religious faith, but it's just some kind of faith, you know. So, so actually for me, it goes back to something like what Mencius said, right? There was just this expression of, you know, seeing something and just want to do something to help. And they're basically very simple, nothing more than that. So this can exist among, it doesn't need to be religious people for this to happen. Now, obviously, it doesn't happen for everybody. These are people who would sacrifice so much of their time and, career and everything like that for doing this kind of thing, is obviously a very, very small minority among people. But to more or less degree, I mean, these are kind of extreme cases, but I think to more or less degree, most of us have this, right? And when we also wish we could do something, right? I mean, so I think this is the expression of our spirit. So, remember the beginning of our class, I talked about our body, our mind, and our spirit. And our spirit really is beyond our self-interest. It is beyond simply the protection of our body and our ego. Our spirit really wants to reach out. Our spirit really wants to reach out. So for most of us, that simply is that we want to reach out to our own friends. We want to reach out to our own family. We want the best for our family. We want the best for our friends, but we really wish we could do something for society, for the world, for humanity. We really do, this is really what we are. So this is our spirit. And then sometimes for some people, it kind of explodes and they start doing something that is really in that way. And sometimes it explodes just a little bit, and sometimes in a big way, right? But so I think this is really part of human nature. That's really part of what we are. Any questions or comments right now before I continue?
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a question out of curiosity. I mean, in the study you conducted in Hanbang, I mean, the religious volunteer groups. I mean, are the members of the group monks or nuns, or are they just ordinary religious people who still lead a very largely secular life?
Yeah, they were not monks or priests or anything like that. They were not religious, specialized religious professionals. They were not monks, priests, or anything like that. They were ordinary people. Yeah, ordinary people, secular people. So one group was Christian, one group was Buddhist, Buddhist from mainland China, and one group was Buddhist from Taiwan. But all the volunteers were completely secular, normal people, like not receiving a salary from the religious organization to be a religious professional. Yeah. So then, okay, so now, so this leads to the question that, because actually then now I even gave some examples that non-religious people, this happens with non-religious people and non-religious groups. So it's not that religious groups have a monopoly on this kind of thing, right? So I think that spirituality is something that is universal, and it is not necessarily expressed through religion. But I think that religion, and actually the purpose of religion, is actually to unleash this spirituality, to tell us about it and to train it, or to unleash it. So that is the function of a religious organization, is to lead us to live a more spiritual life. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean lead us to live a life exactly like those volunteers who sacrifice everything. But religious groups do present such very pure people as models, okay? And then encourage us to follow that way. And then in our own life, we follow it a little tiny bit, or we follow it a lot, or we follow it not at all, okay? So religions, the function of religion is to use the concepts used at the beginning of the class is to provide a mindscape where, first of all, who are you? Like, how do you see yourself in your mindscape? And so if your mindscape, in your mindscape, what is your image of your own self? Like, who am I, right? In my mindscape, who am I and what is a human being? Now, the religious mindscape tells you that in your heart, you actually, there is something pure and something good in your heart. So that's who you are. That's who I am. I actually am. I actually have that purity in me. But also I have some pollution in me too. Okay. So this is in different ways. The religions tell you who you are, and they tell you about that goodness in your heart, that there's something of God in you, that right, you have that purity before committing sin. You have that right, that pure Buddha nature, right? You have your spirit. You have it there. So that is really who you really are. So it kind of tells you who you really are. So how can you really be yourself, right? Now, then the religion also tells you, but something is blocking you from being yourself. So it's these ignorance, these desires, and everything like that. So the religion is putting that in your mindscape, a certain idea of yourself in your mindscape. And it's also creating a community that would encourage you in that direction. So this is the function of religion. But then this takes me to the second point, which is, well, let's look at actually existing religious groups and communities and people in the world, and non-religious groups and people and communities. Now, many religious groups are not necessarily successfully playing that function. Maybe they lost it, okay? So then don't think that because the examples I gave in my reading, they were religious examples, that doesn't mean that all religious people are doing these kinds of things. That doesn't mean that all religious people have pure motives. That doesn't mean that all religious organizations have pure motives. And in fact, many religious organizations are just not doing these things, okay? But that's like, how can I say? Just like some hospitals are not good hospitals. They're not treating their patients well. Some schools are not educating people well. So some religious organizations are not developing people's spirituality well. So they're not playing their function well, okay? So if we see let's not imagine, oh, there's a religious group, it must be doing good things. Well, maybe not, actually, okay? Now, then the other way around is that actually then we have many secular groups that are actually doing very good things, and they're actually training people and providing people with a good, they're trying to provide people with encouragement. They're trying to provide people to provide people with motivation, give people confidence, give people support, and all of these different things. So actually, then we have non-religious groups that are actually playing that function or trying to play that function. So then when we actually look at what's going on in society, then we'll see things are actually quite complicated. And it's not so simple as, oh, religious people are good and non-religious people are not good. Religious organizations are doing good things and non-religious organizations are not doing good things. No, absolutely not, right? Okay. So but we need to distinguish between so what is our human nature on the one hand, and then what is the way to develop the good side of our human nature? Okay, so this is really the question. What is the way to do it? And it's very difficult to do it all alone. So then you need right, the mindscape needs to be set up in a certain way. Social support needs to be provided. A nurturing environment needs to be created in order that we can develop the positive side, or the spiritual side of our human nature, our spiritual nature. So how can that be done? So actually, this is a big question. And in the lectures of today, this week, and the readings of today, there will be more discussion of the problems of religion. Okay, so how religion is deals with the sometimes the inability to play that function, to play its own role in a sense. But I do want to go back nonetheless to the to discuss just a little bit more about some examples. So, okay, many religious groups, so as I said, do not necessarily nurture spirituality effectively. And then many non-religious groups are actually doing good things and supporting people and doing all kinds of great projects and things like that. Okay, so that the distinction between religious and non-religious groups is actually not necessarily very obvious, right? And but I still want to share a few examples that, for me anyway, tells me that we have to really look very much at the spiritual foundation here. Look at our spiritual nature. I once went to West Africa. To Ivory Coast, Ke de Diwa, or Xiangya Hai'an in Chinese. It's a country in West Africa. And I went there as a project teaching the Baha'i faith, actually. So, and I went to a very rural, a very far area, very, very poor. Just a second. So this was a very, very poor area. I mean, some children, actually, their clothes was plastic bags, okay? That was their shirt. They actually just took an old plastic bag, made a hole in it, and that was their shirt. So it was really a poor place, okay? So we would, and I went and joined some local Baha'is who were from the local ethnic group called Yakuba. And we would go from one village to another and we would introduce the Baha'i faith. And there's something about the Baha'i faith which really tries to stay very close to, our spiritual, I would say, our spiritual nature, is to say that, we all have this goodness in our nature. So we all have to release it. And if we release it, we will be very, very motivated to do that. And so we don't go in and promise material benefits to people. Now, when we went into various villages, so actually some people thought, oh, here's another group. Oh, it's another NGO. Oh, it's another religion. So they asked, okay, so are you going to build us a church? Oh, okay. Are you going to build us a mosque? Oh, okay. Are you going to build us a school? And for all these things, we said, sorry, no, we're not going to build you any of these things. You will build it for yourself. So after we went around the villages, and then later there was a training. So in the kind of the town, it was decided that we would train some some teachers to teach the children in basic moral education, basic moral and spiritual education, and also basic literacy. And so if somebody became a teacher of a Baha'i children's class, they would have to go back to their village, but there would be no building, no material, nothing at all. They would have to do it under a tree and start having the class for their children. So no material benefit whatsoever. Now then, we were amazed that so many volunteered to come to learn how to become a teacher and to be a volunteer children's class teacher, and they would get nothing. And they would, literally no material benefit whatsoever. I was just totally, I was blown away. I was actually blown away by this. And the funny thing is that then they continued for years and years. And, I went there for a month, but later I found that there had been a civil war in this region. Everything was destroyed. So many things happened. But like 10 years later, this community was stronger and stronger, even though they had received no material help whatsoever. Now, when I visited, I also saw a school that was built by the Canadian government. So the Canadian government spent millions of dollars to build a school in this place. And so it built a school. Here's a nice school, nice classrooms, books, computers, everything like that. So the government built it, and then the government left. And then after a while, the local people took the money, and then they took the computers, and they even took the building apart. They took the bricks of the school to make their own houses. So it was really interesting that, so the Canadian government had a very material view of education. So it built a school, and it didn't care anything about people's motivation. So it was actually unable to sustain the project, and the project fell apart. But when we went with the educational project, we actually brought no money, but actually then we were able to sustain a whole educational system, which had only a few books, and that's it. No building, no nothing. And to train later, hundreds of teachers would be trained. And so little schools popping up under trees and in people's houses, in their own families and things like that, right? So that kind of school, people were not stealing from it. They were not, this was a school that they built with their own love, nothing else. So even a civil war couldn't stop it. The Civil War could destroy buildings, but it couldn't destroy people's love in their heart for their children, for the children of their community. So now, of course, material is also important, right? I mean, it rains, and everything like that. So you don't want to be always having a school under a tree. There are insects biting you, there's snakes, there's all of these kind of things. You want a building. So from the perspective of the Baha'i community, once there is a strong foundation, a strong spiritual foundation of people who are working out of their love, and they showed it and they did it for a long time, then you can start building a school on top of it, because the foundation is strong. They have shown that they really care. They have developed their spirituality. They have released their spirit. So now we can have a school building, and we know that they aren't going to steal everything from the school building. They will take care of the school building. They will, they will show love to their building because they love their classes. They love their children. They have developed that capacity to love. So this is, then you have, in another country in Central Africa, literally there was a civil war in Central African Republic. The entire education system of the whole country was destroyed. So after this, everything was destroyed. What was left? Some villages where there's strong Baha'i communities, well, they were still teaching their own classes under trees and in houses and things like that. And then now when they started to rebuild the whole educational infrastructure for the country, well, there was a education system was right there that Baha'is had been teaching throughout Civil War, anything. They didn't stop. Nobody had, they hardly had any money, but they were doing. So now those Baha'i teachers, now they could help to build the national education system. So for me, this is the power of faith. This is the power of our spirit. This is the power of faith. And then the function of the religious organizations, such as the Baha'i Faith, is to develop this, is to develop it. And well, there are many challenges along the way. So you have to learn, right? It's just like a business has to learn how to make money. So a religious group has to learn how to develop this. And if a business is not following a proper way, it will, it will fail in its function. So similarly, religious groups may very well fail to do to play that to play their role, So for me, that's the role of a religion, and it's always a learning process. And so that takes to the third aspect, which is the effects of the actions. Actually, many charity groups and volunteer groups, they do things with very good intention, but actually what they're doing might not have a good effect. And actually that's what we saw in West Africa. So many NGOs coming, always giving them something. I give you this, I give you that, So after a while, they're like, oh, you're coming, give me, right? They just want to take, because they know these NGOs come and spend their money and go. So they just want to take. So actually, in the long term, a lot of the charity work, maybe it's actually not helpful for people. Maybe it's making people more dependent. It might not be good for people. Some NGOs are actually, more interested to write reports to their sponsors, to say, oh, I did this, I did that, I did this, I did that. And then what did they actually, but they're more interested to report on their good actions to the government in their own country, or to foundations to give them money and things like that. So we know all of this, right? And we've seen news reports about that, right? So actually some NGOs, and it doesn't matter, non-religious or religious NGOs, are either actually not that interested in, don't really care that much about the people they're serving, or they do, they might really, really care very much, but what they're doing might not actually be very helpful. Okay, so obviously, so again, there's the issue of purity of motive and the effect. So I think the first thing is, well, we've got to develop our purity of motive. But even if we have a pure motive, then we still have to use our brain and to think carefully. Now, I want to do good. I want to do good for society. I want to help the community. I want to help others. Well, there are many ways of doing that. So what's a good way to do it, right? How can we express our goodness in a way that is good, right? So that's a whole other topic, and I don't have time to talk about it now. But in a sense, for me, this is then where we need actually, you actually need more scientific ways of thinking. You have to look, so what is the result of what I'm doing, right? What's the effect? Is it good? Is it not good, right? So good intention is not the only thing, right? Then is the result, right? Then is the result. Okay, any more comments or questions at this stage of So then to continue to speak about the purity of motive. So then many of people, you actually noted that, okay, well, this idea, let's say gongde, right? So are these volunteers actually being selfish because they want to enhance their spiritual capital? They want to enhance their spiritual merit. They want to come closer to God. So actually many of you wrote about this kind of issue. Like, are they actually really, is their motive pure? Actually, maybe it's not pure. Maybe it's actually very selfish and self-interested in another way. So I think this really points out to, again, our motives are always very complicated, right? Our motives are always very complicated. So I think, as one of you mentioned, you could actually be doing this volunteering or charity work actually in a purely instrumental and even a pre-conventional way, right? So I don't care about the people I'm serving. I just want to, right, enhance my gongde, right? So I don't care, right? All I care is for myself. So there's this kind of possibility, right? There's this kind of possibility. And actually, frankly, I think we see this a lot in fangsheng, right? People are releasing fish into the ocean as a kind of gongde, right? Or they release birds into the air, right? As a kind of gongde, right? Do they really care about these fish or about these birds? I don't know, right? So it could be really kind of pre-conventional morality, right? Just for yourself. Because, right, it was shown like in Taiwan, they are releasing some Buddhists are releasing so many fish into the a lake in the Riyuetan in the middle of Taiwan. But actually these fish are eating up all the local fish, and so it's destroying the environment of the lake, right? So again, you want to do good, you should think about the results of what you're doing, right? But these people, a lot of them, they might not really care, right? They just, oh, I give more fish, I release fish, I will have good, I will have a better rebirth, right? So pre-conventional morality, right? Okay, then we have conventional morality, right? Oh, it's good to do good, right? Everybody will cheer us. So some of you mentioned, oh, you want to be praised by other people, so you will do some good deeds, right? I want to be a civilized civilized household, right? You go 文明家户, right? Or something like that, right? So receive this kind of recognition. Or, right, I want to put on my resume, right? To put the volunteering on my resume, something like that. Or just my religious community is always like encouraging people to go and do some good deeds, so I will do it, even though I'm just doing it to follow others, okay? So this kind of conventional morality would also exist, right, in the altruistic and volunteering behavior. But then the post-conventional. And so I think that some of the examples that I gave, however, are really post-conventional, right? So actually those groups in that I saw in Hanwang, or that I even mentioned, those other groups that I mentioned today in Beijing, and those kind of people who stopped eating hot pot and playing mahjong, right? This is very post-conventional, because nobody's encouraging them to do that. And even if they're Buddhist, well, you could do other easier ways to acquire merit, like just donate money to a temple. You could acquire merit that way. There are other ways to acquire merit, or to be very religious, to come closer to God, so to speak. So if that's your motivation, you could find easier ways to do it, right? So I think that, so I think that there are people who reach this post-conventional level, which is just like, it's just the expression of their purity of heart. They're really just doing something because they think it's good. And I don't think they're really doing it for spiritual rewards or material reward or any kind of reward, right? So I think they're reaching this kind of post-conventional, and what in the stages of moral development, what is also called the higher one, which is the right, which is like the cosmic awareness. So of course they don't use this word, but basically where you just feel love for everybody around you. You feel at one, so you just want to do something, so this is right, it's even beyond the post-conventional morality, right? So we could find all of these stages of moral development in the altruistic behavior. Some of them are more self-interested and others are less self-interested. And actually for everybody, it would always be a mixture, except for some people, right? Like Jesus and like Buddha or whatever, who are pure, absolutely pure. For most people, it would just be a mixture. Nobody is pure and is absolutely pure in their motive. But through spirituality, people can try to become purer, to become more pure in their motivations. So related to those stages of moral development, then some people mention something like Maslow's, and that's very well known, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So this another psychological theory where people first have their basic needs of security, and then they will have more material needs, and then they will have more leisure needs, and then they will have more like self-actualization. So there's Maslow's pyramid of needs. So once you satisfied one, you will move to the next one and the next one. So there is this idea. And to some extent, I think this theory works. And actually, we could see this in China, in mainland China, because we could see that for a long time, people were just struggling for their own basic, their basic needs. And then once they had those basic needs, then they would be more struggling for their quality of life. And then once they had acquired a certain quality of life, then you could see a lot of rich people in China. Then they want to do charity and they want to do meaningful things and more spiritual things, right? So we could actually see this in China. But I'm also not totally convinced by this because, as I said, I've been to very poor places like Africa. And from the experience of the Baha'i community, and I've looked at the experience of other religious communities, people in very, very poor situations, they can also show very high levels of altruism, of spirituality. It is not the case that poor people are more selfish and that the rich people are less selfish because they have more money. Actually, what's surprising is that actually it's a little bit the opposite. Or, I don't think you can make a causal relationship, okay? That being more rich makes you more generous and being poorer makes you less generous. I'm not sure about that. I mean, there's been all kinds of research and I don't think there's any conclusion either way. And I have lived in very poor places and I've lived in very rich places. And all I can say is that no matter in a very poor place, you will find some people who are extremely generous and you'll find people who are extremely petty and greedy. And then among very rich people, and I've also met some very rich people. I also worked with a lot of really rich people when I was in Sichuan, and I've worked, right, when I was working with them, I also took them to the United States and I introduced them to business people in the United States, everything like that. Anyway, same thing. So among very rich people, I also met some very generous, incredibly pure-hearted people. But I also, they're incredibly greedy and selfish people too. So as far as my experience shows, we cannot say that somehow poor people don't have spiritual, they don't have spiritual needs, they don't have spiritual capacities. And right, you can't say that rich people are greedy or rich people are generous. Some of them are more greedy, some of them are more generous. And like everyone, no matter rich or poor, everybody is kind of a mixture, right? Everybody has a complicated human nature. So finally, then, I'm just going to mention two more points. So one is that, like a number of you mentioned, but isn't the material aspect also important, right? So here we're talking about spirituality, but let's say the homeless for the poor, the group that's helping the homeless people, Mother's Choice and this and that. So don't they also need material capital? And don't they, of course, so I'm not saying, so we should stop thinking in dichotomous. So it's just funny, whenever you talk about spirituality, then some people say, but what about the material? But what about the material? But what about the material? We have to talk about the material. But of course, our society is always talking about the material, right? So it's not one against the other. Let's stop thinking that one is against the other. I think this is a product of our brainwashing in the current materialist operating system. Every time you mention something about spirit, they say, no, what about material? It's like, look, our society is devoting 90% of its effort and energy on material issues. So now you just want to mention a little bit about spiritual side, and then somehow the material, somehow it's like, no, or somehow it's like, we also have to talk about the material side. But it's like, it's like, We literally are. You know, we are talking about how to develop materially all the time. Okay, right? We are spending a lot of our energy talking about that and working about that and improving that. So it's like, yes, the material dimension is important. And yes, we already are devoting enormous amounts of our energy on material development. Now, how much of our energy are we devoting to our spiritual development? Not that much. And why is it that a lot of groups that are actually supposed to be devoted to their spiritual development, maybe they're having challenges doing it? Well, maybe because we're actually spending very little of our time thinking about how to develop our spiritual capacities, right? So to talk about developing our spiritual capacities, our spirituality, does not mean, oh, we should shut out the material. Not at all, right? Not at all. So go back to lesson, I think it was lesson 2 or 3, and I talked about that, right? So we've got to get out of the dualistic mindset, right? To talk about spirituality does not mean we don't need to eat, we don't need a house, we don't need to be, comfortable, and all these things, right? So finally, then the point that I wanted to make, and I think this is again an issue of, I really think it's kind of ideological issue. So I talked last week about the vaccine companies, right? And I said, well, I think this is, and actually I really do think this is a crime against humanity, all right? Vaccine companies are refusing to release the intellectual property, and they're refusing to help in the widespread production and dissemination of the vaccines. And so one of you mentioned, and this is actually what the drug companies are saying themselves, and this is what the American government, the British government, basically all Western governments are saying. They're saying the same thing as the drug manufacturers. They're saying, well, we devoted so much money to research and development of these vaccines. We invest so much money to develop these vaccines. So this is our intellectual property. And if you take it away from us, we have no motivation to develop these vaccines. So you've got to let us make money off of it, because that's how it works. We're already serving humanity in a great way by developing these vaccines. So don't criticize us. If you take it away from us, we're not going to do any more research. Okay, so this is basically the discourse. But, okay, come on. The drug companies actually receive hundreds of millions of dollars of subsidies from the government. Okay, first of all, so actually the American government paid Moderna, gave a huge subsidy to Moderna to develop its vaccine. So the government is subsidizing, helping the drug company to develop the vaccine, and B, governments around the world are buying these vaccines from those companies. So these companies are going to be so incredibly, like, the profits they're going to make from this pandemic are just gigantic, like billions of doses of vaccine. And the profit margin is not low on these drugs, okay? So they're like awash in money. These are already some of the richest multinational companies in the world. And now the pandemic is giving them this massive sales. Like, they could say they're selling billions and billions of doses and making money on every single one of them. Okay. So it's not like these are poor companies that are going to go bankrupt. These companies are actually richer than than most countries in the world. So of course, let them make money, let them make a profit. But they have no responsibility to share, when the humanity is at when humanity is literally facing this kind of humanitarian crisis, they have no responsibility to do anything. They already make so much money just selling the vaccine doses to the Canadian, the American, the French, to European, to all these governments. They're already making billions of dollars in profits selling to Western countries. So if they provide it, if they provide the intellectual property to third world countries and poor countries to develop the vaccines, will it harm their profit? Not at all. They'll still making huge billions and billions of profit. Okay. So always this argument. So this is really the argument that self-interest is more important than anything else. And they believe it. So they actually really think that they're helping humanity, right? So what they're saying is that there's no value to creating medicines if you're not going to make a profit. Well, I mean, I don't know. Like here at University of Hong Kong, we're a nonprofit educational institution. Well, we develop all kinds of medicines and things like that. And we do it because we love it. You know, we care about it. We think it's valuable, right? So actually now I'm a full professor. So I could actually stop doing any research right now and I wouldn't lose my job. But because I love my research and I really hope that somehow it could help people. I mean, I don't know if it really helps people, but at least, you know, I wish, right? So I do it. I work far more than 40 hours a week, which is a full-time job. Well, you know, why should I do it? If self-interest is the only thing that matters, I could just relax. Now I'm a full professor, teach a few courses, and then I don't do any research because nobody's going to fire me, right? So why do professors keep working when they have a tenured position? Because they really love their work and they care about it, right? So can't drug companies do the same, right? When they have enough profit, can't they just do it for the love of doing it, right? When they've you know, when they've met their basic needs and making a lot of profit, can't they just be satisfied with that? No, they want even more. Actually, there's no limit to the amount of profit that they want. So, okay, so I'm getting really, you know, I'm getting all. So maybe some of you would disagree. But this is an argument, okay? This is really an argument, and drug companies have their arguments, and there is a counter argument. There is a counter argument to this. There is a counter argument to this. And I think the reason why the counter argument is valid is that because in the 1950s, the drug companies were not as selfish, and they actually did share the result of their research without asking any questions. So anyway, so I mean, we've really got to think about this. You know, what is it in our society that programs our society to make to distort our human nature? Basically, that's what it is. You know, it's to distort our human nature and to make companies, certain companies, monstrously, really monstrously selfish. That's what I would say, like a monster. Yeah. They're doing good things. I'm not saying they're doing bad things. Yeah, developing drugs is a great thing. You know, they're doing good, very, very good things. No doubt about it. But is it true that they would not do good things if they shared a little bit, right? All right. So that's enough for my rant. Any questions or arguments or comments? All right then. So Steve, how about putting on the